Hey everyone, this is Gary from My Sacred Honor, and forgive me, I have a cold, and I would like you to share this with as many people as possible. I once read this on an old channel of mine called The Unknown Patriot, which I deleted and switched over to My Sacred Honor. And this is a perfect story for this day and age. So, it's called The Wild and Free Pigs of the Okefennokee Swamp. Some years ago, about 1900, an old trapper from North Dakota hitched up some horses to his Studebaker wagon, packed a few possessions, especially his traps, drove south. Several weeks later, he stopped in a small town just north of the Okefennokee Swamp in Georgia. It was a Saturday morning, a lazy day, when he walked into the general store. Sitting around the potbelly stove were 7 or 8 of the town's local citizens. The traveler spoke. "Gentlemen, could you direct me to the Okefennokee Swamp?" Some of the old-timers looked at him as if he was crazy. "You must be a stranger in these parts," they said. "I am. I'm from North Dakota," said the stranger. "Well, in the Okefennokee Swamp are thousands of wild hogs," one old man explained. "A man who goes into the swamp by himself asks to die." He lifted up his leg. "I lost half my leg here to those pigs at the swamp." Another old feller, "Look at the cuts on me. Look at my arm. Bit off. Those pigs have been free since the Revolution, eating snakes and rooting out roots and fending for themselves for over 100 years. They're wild. They're dangerous. You can't trap them. No man dare go into the swamp by himself." Every man nodded his head in agreement. The old trapper said, "Thank you so much for the warning. Now, could you direct me to the swamp?" They said, "Well, yeah, it's due south, straight down the road." But they begged the stranger not to go because they knew he'd meet a terrible fate. He said, "Sell me 10 sacks of corn and help me load it on the wagon." And they did. And the old trapper bid them farewell and drove down the road. The townsfolk thought they'd never see him again. 2 weeks later, the man came back and pulled up to the general store and got off the wagon. Walked in and bought 10 more sacks of corn. After loading it, he went back down the road towards the swamp. 2 weeks later, he returned again and bought 10 more sacks of corn. This went on for a month, then 2 months, and 3. Every week or two, the old trapper would come into town on a Saturday morning, load up 10 sacks of corn, and drive south into the swamp. The stranger soon became a legend in the little village, and the subject of much speculation. People wondered what kind of devil had possessed this man that he could go into the swamp by himself and not be consumed by the wild pigs. One morning the man came into town as usual. Everybody thought he wanted more corn. He got off the wagon and went into the store where the usual group of men gathered around the stove. He took off his gloves and said, "Gentlemen, I need to hire about 10-15 wagons. I need 20-30 men. I have 6,000 hogs out in the swamp penned up, and they're hungry. I've got to get them to market right away." "You got what in the swamp?" asked the storekeeper incredulously. "I have 6,000 hogs penned up. They haven't eaten for 2-3 days, and they'll starve if I don't get back there to take care of them and feed them." One of the old-timers said, "You mean you captured the wild pigs the wild hogs of the Okefennokee?" "That's right." "How'd you do that? What did you do?" the men urged breathlessly. One of them exclaimed, "But I lost my arm." "I lost my brother," cried another. "I lost my legs," to the wild boars chimed in a third. The trapper said, "Well, the first week I went in there, they were wild all right. They hid in the undergrowth, wouldn't come out. I dare not get off the wagon. So I spread some corn along the wagon, and every day I'd spread a sack of corn. The old pigs would have nothing to do with me. But the younger pigs decided that it was easier to eat free corn than it was to root out roots and catch snakes. So the very young began to eat the corn first. I did this every day. Pretty soon, even the old pigs decided it was easier to eat free corn. After all, they were still free, and they were not penned up, and they could run off in any direction they wanted to, at any time. The next thing was to get them used to eating in the same place all the time. So I selected a clearing, and I started putting the corn out in the clearing. At first, they wouldn't come to the clearing. It was too far, it was too open, it was a nuisance. But the very young decided it was easier to take the corn in the clearing than it was to root out roots and catch wild snakes. And not long thereafter, the old pigs also decided that it was easier to come to the clearing every day. And so the pigs learned to come to the clearing every day and get their free corn. They could still subsidize their diet with roots and snakes, or whatever else they wanted to. After all, they were free. They could run in any direction at any time. There were no bounds upon them. The next step was to get them used to fence posts. So I put fence posts all the way around the clearing. I put them in the underbrush so that they wouldn't get suspicious or upset. After all, they were just sticks sticking up out of the ground, like the trees and the brush. The corn was out there every day, and it was easy to walk in between the posts and get the corn and walk out. This went on for a week or two. Shortly they became very used to walking into the clearing, getting the free corn, and walking out through the fence post. Next step was to put one rail down at the bottom. I also left a few openings so the older, fatter pigs could walk through the openings, and the younger pigs could easily jump over the one rail. After all, it was no real threat to their freedom or independence. They could always jump over and flee in any direction that they wanted. Now I decided that I wouldn't feed them every day. I began to feed them every other day. On the days I didn't feed them, the pigs still gathered in the clearing. They squealed, they grunted, they begged and pleaded me to feed them. But I only fed them every other day. I put a second rail around the post. Now the pigs became more desperate for food, because they were no longer used to going out and digging their own roots and finding their own food. Now they needed me. They needed my corn every other day. So I trained them, and I would feed them every other day if they came through the gate. I put up a third rail around the fence, but it was still no great threat to them because there were several gates that they could just run in and out at will. Finally, I put up the fourth rail. Then I closed all the gates but one. I fed them very, very well. And yesterday I closed the last gate, and today I need your help to take these pigs to market. That's the end of the story. The price of free corn, the allegory of the pigs have serious moral lessons. This story is about federal money being used to bait and trap and enslave a once free and independent people. That's us people. Federal welfare, in its myriad of forms, has reduced not only individuals to a state of dependency. State and local governments are also on track to elimination due to their functions being subverted by the command and control structures of federal revenue sharing programs. This is us, and I really, truly think it's one of the best allegories I've ever heard on the American people and where we've come from. I've told you in previous videos that I knew people in World War I, growing up as a boy, and World War II, and they were a very different cut of people. They were very worried to death about Social Security, and we give our Social Security numbers out all the time. They wouldn't have. They didn't want an ID card. They were different than we are. We have learned to suck on the American tit, and we need to stop, and we need to regroup, and we need to change the direction of this country. Thank you for listening, and please share this. Please.